When we're doing moral philosophy, we want to make sure we focus on and pay attention to this notion of obligation. Obligations are something a little bit different than what we might kind of tend to think of. So the word ought, when we're doing moral philosophy, carries a lot of weight. We want to kind of call attention to that. So, for example, I might say something to my daughter along the following line, you really ought to brush your teeth twice a day. Or I might say something like, you ought to make sure your gas never goes below a quarter of tank. This is one way in which we use the word ought, but it doesn't really kind of involve the moral obligation, the sort of moral requirement that we tend to think of when we're doing moral philosophy, when we're doing ethics. When I tell my daughter you ought to brush your teeth twice a day, what I'm doing is I'm kind of giving her a recommendation. It's sort of a practical way or a practical guide to how she should live her life. If she doesn't want to get cavities, then she should brush her teeth. We want to focus on this notion of ought because it carries a lot of weight. And so one way that I'm going to try to do that is by pointing out two different moral principles that employ this notion of ought so we can kind of see the importance of it, especially when we start talking about obligations that, say, a doctor might have towards their patient. Should the doctor be morally obligated to always tell the truth and always give all of the relevant information to the patient? Is there a moral obligation to make sure that the patient completely understands everything that's involved when they're signing anything or giving their consent over? What about for cases where we're doing certain experiments or in certain scientific research? Are there certain obligations that are required when people are participating in these? Let's begin with the principle that says, if you have a moral obligation to do such and such, then it better be the case that you can do it. So this is a notion called ought implies can. So we might say, if Smith ought to phi, then Smith can phi. Right? We wouldn't want to say that Smith has an obligation to phi if it's impossible for Smith to phi. The kind of example we might have in mind is, let's say that you are standing in front of a little kiddie pool, right? There's those little kiddie pools you can get at Walmart pretty cheap. They're real shallow. So let's say that there's a child, a very young child, who's in the kiddie pool, and the child starts to drown. Now you might get your clothes wet, and it might be kind of an inconvenience for you to reach down and pick the child up and save the child's life and everything. But we might think that you have a moral obligation to do it. It certainly seems like you can do it. And it looks like we maybe sometimes would want to say you have a moral duty, a moral obligation to do that. So on the other hand, let's say that somebody is drowning in a river. You're walking on a bridge nearby, you happen to notice it. If you are unable to swim, if it means that if you were to jump into the river and attempt to save this person who's drowning, if you would also drown in that situation, because you couldn't swim, or maybe you're too young to do that, then it looks like you don't have a moral obligation to save that person. You may want to, you may even try to, you may risk your life, but it seems as though in order to say you do have a moral obligation to save the person from drowning, it better be the case that you know how to swim. It better be the case that you have the ability to save them. Here's a good example that I like to use. Imagine you're standing on the Grand Canyon. You're right here, standing on the Grand Canyon, okay? And on the other side of the Grand Canyon, you happen to notice there's this ledge on the Grand Canyon. It's real far away because the Grand Canyon's super large. But you happen to notice that there's some people riding on donkeys. Terribly drawn donkeys. But the point is, you happen to notice that this particular donkey right here, right on the edge, there's a young child who's sitting on a saddle that is kind of swaying back and forth, let's say. And you're seeing this happening because you happen to be looking through some binoculars so you can see to the other side, and you notice this terrible accident's about to occur. And sure enough, this child falls and dies. It's a terrible thing. And you see the whole thing happen, right? Now, you may really, really want to save the child. You may even scream and shout. You may even call up the police on the other side, right? But most likely, no matter how loud you scream, nothing's going to be able to prevent that child from falling to their death, right? And so, is it within your power? Do you have the ability? Can you save the child? No. It looks like you can't, unfortunately. You may want to, but unfortunately, you're unable to. So it looks like we would not say in this situation that you have a moral obligation to save the child. Why? Well, because it looks like in order to have a moral obligation, it better be the case that you can do it, that you can save the child, right? If you ought to save the child, if you ought to fine, then you can fine. But if Smith cannot fine, if it's not within your power to save the child, then Smith is not obligated to fine. It's not the case that Smith would have to fine, would have an obligation to fine. So that's the basic understanding of ought implies that you can do it, right? If you have a moral ought obligation, it better be the case that you have the ability to do that thing that you're obligated to do. Let's suppose now that, you're standing right here on the edge of the Grand Canyon, but what if you're Superman or Superwoman, right? That's supposed to be a cape. Superman can fly, right? Superman can definitely fly and save the young child. In the fiction, Superman saves Lois Lane all the time, and Superwoman saves lots of people too. So it looks like it is within the power for Superman or Superwoman to fly down and save the young child. Does that mean that Superman or Superwoman has a moral obligation to save the child? Superman can save the child. Does Superman have an obligation, an ought? Ought Superman save the child? That's the question that we also want to pay attention to. You might think, yeah, Superman better do it. Superman has a moral obligation to do it. If Superman said to us, you know what, guys, I'm just really sick and tired of saving so many people. We might want to say of Superman, not only is he kind of being a jerk, but he's doing something morally wrong. Because he can. If anyone can, Superman can. There might be other cases, kind of counter examples to the situation. Take, for example, your ability to send some money to, let's say, Africa in order to save some starving children. Is that within my ability to do? Sure, I have money in my bank, and I have the ability to get on my phone and press a button that would send some money to relieve famine. Presumably you do too, right? Presumably it's within your ability, your power. You can do that as well. Does that mean that you and I have a moral obligation to send our money to save some starving children? That's not as clear. That's a more controversial claim. Most moral philosophers are going to say, yes, if you have a moral obligation to do something, that better be within your power to do it. Yet there's going to be a lot of dispute. It's very controversial whether or not just simply having the ability to do something automatically means you have an obligation to